and red and all that. The first game between Kansas and Villanova was not particularly close ever. Kansas ran all over Villanova, and to me, it was a lack of depth on Villanova's part and not being able to overcome the absence of Justin Moore, especially on the offensive end. Ochai Agbaji, the shooting guard for Kansas, had pretty easy time shooting. He was 6 of 7 from behind the arc. And Villanova had no real answer for David McCormick inside with their big guys. He was much more tough. He's a little bigger than most of the guys that he was going against. And it made for a pretty easy time for Kansas to just walk right into the national title game. The other Final Four game between Duke and North Carolina was much more competitive, as it should be when you got rivals playing each other with that kind of high stakes. As I mentioned last week, it was the first time that these two legendary blue blood rivals were meeting in the NCAA tournament, and it was also possibly Coach K's final game for Duke, which, spoiler alert, it ended up being his final game. Both teams had been red hot since entering the tournament. Duke was playing pretty good defense and good offense. North Carolina, despite their lack of depth and only playing really 6 guys per game, was executing really well and is a very athletic and talented team and was keeping teams on their toes. This game, they went back and forth throughout. The difference was North Carolina, in the final minute or so, was able to execute better and make their free throws and snag an 81-77 win, which meant that 8 seed North Carolina would be playing 1 seed Kansas in the championship game Monday night in New Orleans. North Carolina got off to a hot start, and Agbaji was not a good shooter for the first 3 quarters of this game, probably. However, in the second half, Kansas played a lot better. Some people will say that the coaching on North Carolina wasn't as good in the second half. That's a fair assessment, I would say, but you got to give Kansas a little credit there as well. They played faster and better in the second half. I pointed to a lack of depth being a possible downfall for North Carolina quite a few times during this tournament, and this is the game where it came into play. Guard Caleb Love had a brief injury and had to leave the game briefly, but he came back in the game. That's not the big one that hurt them. The big one was forward Armando Bacot, who ended up with 15 points and 15 rebounds, was a monster in the paint all game, especially during these last particular possessions around the time he got hurt. He was only 3 for 13 from the field, but it felt like he was playing a lot better than that. He was manhandling them in the paint, was playing very physically. Tried to drive on the Kansas defense and slipped and rolled his ankle and missed the last minute or so of the game. The replay shows that a loose floorboard comes up and his foot starts to slide as soon as that board comes up, which seemed to cause the injury, but supposedly arena personnel checked that spot on the floor and found no loose floorboards later, so who knows what the hell actually happened. He ended up turning the ball over on that play. Kansas went back down, gave the ball to McCormick, took advantage of Bacot not being there, and went right to work in the paint. Went from a 1-point lead to a 2-point lead on a nice little jump hook from McCormick. North Carolina tried to get a score and failed, but then Kansas on the ensuing inbound after causing the turnover turned it over themselves with the guard stepping on the out-of-bounds line almost immediately after catching the inbound. Credit Kansas's defense for stepping up after that because they didn't give Carolina a very clean look from 3 at the end, and Kansas ultimately survived as the heave fell short. Kansas came back from a total 16-point deficit, which makes for the largest overall comeback in the championship game history and the largest second-half comeback, being down 15 at halftime. It is also Bill Self's second national title, coming 14 years after his first, which was also at Kansas in 2008. Meanwhile, the rest of the college basketball world has also been in the news. If you'll remember, LSU fired their head coach Will Wade just before the tournament after an investigation into recruiting activities and stuff like that. And again, I mentioned last week when we were going over the transfer portal, I expect several departures from the program in the offseason, but it's even worse than you could predict it. As of right now, every single LSU scholarship player has entered the transfer portal. They are starting from scratch, literally. All walk-on. I mean, obviously they can hit the transfer portal themselves. They can offer, I guess, as many freshmen as they want, but it's not the start you want. Obviously, they could be loyal to Wade and not wanting to play for somebody else and wanting to distance themselves from a program that's facing whatever penalties they're facing. I mean, regardless of the reasoning, it's not a good look, and it's going to make for a really difficult season next year unless they're able to recruit a bunch of impact transfers. It's not the kind of start you want under a new head coach. Speaking of new head coaches, Seton Hall lost Kevin Willard to Maryland and will now replace him with St. Peter's head coach Shaheen Holloway. Holloway was a former Seton Hall star, led them to the Sweet 16 back in the late 90s, early 2000s, I forget what it was. So he was probably on their radar anyway once they found out Willard was leaving for Maryland. It just so happens that he made a big impact and a big name for himself on the national stage with that St. Peter's team, making them the first 15 seed to ever make it as far as the Elite Eight. Definitely earned it, especially the way the Peacocks were playing late in the year. Since that time, the three of the Peacock star players, Doug Eddert, who you'll know is the mustache guy basically, Matthew Lee and Darryl Banks have all entered the transfer portal. Obviously, they could go anywhere in theory. You'll have to see who they hear from, what they're thinking. But it wouldn't be a surprise at all if you see at least one, maybe even all three, follow Holloway to Seton Hall. Other notable guys in the transfer portal since the last time we talked about this stuff: Western Kentucky's Jalen Butts, Clemson's Al Amir Dawes, Louisville's Dre Davis and Noah Locke, Murray State's Johnny Broom, Talon Cooper and Tevin Brown, Illinois' Omar Payne and Andre Curbelo. We've also had some players declare for the NBA draft already: Michigan State's Gabe Brown, Marcus Bingham Jr., and Max Christie. Christie did not hire an agent and will remain eligible to return to school after receiving feedback. That's what not hiring an agent does for all these guys. It leaves them the option to drop out of the draft and go back to school with no penalty. Wisconsin's Johnny Davis is a projected lottery pick, as well as Auburn's Jabari Smith. Walker Kessler from Auburn has also declared. Ohio State's E.J. Liddell and Malachi Branham. Purdue's Jaden Ivey, Notre Dame freshman guard Blake Wesley, Baylor freshman Kendall Brown, and veteran, I think he was a senior, transfer from Arizona, James Akinjo. Colorado State's David Roddy, not hiring an agent, so maintaining college eligibility. Iowa's Keegan Murray, that was almost a no-brainer after the season that he had. LSU's Tari Eason and Darius Days. Rutgers' Ron Harper Jr., Nebraska's Bryce McGowan's, Memphis's Josh Minot and Lester Quinones, Xavier's Nate Johnson, Providence's Justin Minaya, Arkansas Adiesi Tony, or Adiz Tony, however you say it, Jalen Williams will not hire an agent, and senior J.D. Note, Richmond's Tyler Burton, Kentucky Keon Brooks and Ty Washington, Tennessee's Kennedy Chandler and Santiago Vescovi, Syracuse's Cole Swider, Boise's Marcus Shaver, NC State's Darion Sebron, St. John's Julian Chapene, Wake's Davion Williamson, also not hiring an agent, Texas Tech Adonis Arms and Kevin McCullough, Houston Kyler Edwards. Also of note from college basketball, Kentucky's Oscar Tshiebwe has been named the Wooden Award winner for the best college basketball player this season. Averaged 17.4 points per game and 15.2 rebounds per game, which is outstanding. Led the NCAA in rebounds. He was an All-American, All-SEC, All-SEC defense, SEC Player of the Year. Won the Kareem Abdul-Jabbar Award as the nation's best center, possibly declaring for the draft, but we'll see what happens with him. The Naismith Coach of the Year has been named as Ed Cooley of Providence. Cooley led the Friars to a 27-6 record, which was their best since the 70s, and the school's highest seeding in NCAA tournament history with a 4 seed and their first Sweet 16 appearance since 1997, so 25 years. Legendary coach Fran Dunphy is now returning to college basketball to take over at LaSalle, which plays in the Atlantic 10 and is one of the Big Five college basketball programs in Philadelphia, along with Villanova, Temple, Penn, and St. Joseph's. Dunphy made his mark as an assistant for the LaSalle Explorers before jumping over to take over at Penn, where he was most successful, and further jumping up into a more prominent Division I program in Temple. He's 73 years old, has 13 conference titles overall, with 2 additional conference tournament championships. He stepped down from Temple in April of 2018 and became the school's interim athletic director. And then obviously they figured out who their athletic director was, and now LaSalle, he becomes the first ever coach to coach at least 3 of the 5 Big 5 Philly programs, and he will return to the court with 580 career wins. Also in the college sports world, Big 12 Commissioner Bob Bowlesby has announced he will be stepping down from his position later this year. Bowlesby was in the post for 10 years, and one of his difficult tasks was maneuvering around the Texas and Oklahoma departures, during which he signed Cincinnati, Houston, UCF, and BYU as members of the conference through expansion. The next commissioner will have to deal with welcoming those teams into the conference, negotiating TV contract renewals, possibly more expansion, as it seems like we're heading that way in college sports anyway. Other big things that may be on the back burner there. In further Big 12 news, Baylor University has given athletic director Mack Rhoades a 10-year contract extension. Rhoades has been with the school since 2016, and in that time, the Bears have won 24 conference titles and 6 national titles. Going along with that, the football and basketball programs are playing at their all-time best levels and recruiting at an all-time high. And he was also just named Sports Business Journal's Athletic Director of the Year for 2021. Last little bit of college news, Marshall, Old Dominion, and Southern Miss have all officially left Conference USA to join the Sun Belt. They will be members of the Sun Belt starting this football season. Not long ago, I probably would have considered Conference USA to be the better conference, but things have definitely evened out, and recently Sunbelt seems to churn out more competitive product with maybe some better coaches and some higher win totals and closer games. The change was almost blocked due to some Conference USA bylaws that require a 14-month written notice for teams departing the conference, but on March 29th, they were officially cleared to join the Sunbelt. And like I said, that will start this football season. To the NFL, quickly, Buccaneers head coach Bruce Arians has retired. He said that Tom Brady's return did factor in, but it's not because there's any strain on the relationship or anything. He just wanted to leave his successor in a good spot. That successor is going to be former defensive coordinator Todd Bowles, who has been a head coach in the past with the Jets and redeemed himself. I say redeemed himself just because he got himself back into the coaching conversation after being what would be considered a failed head coach with the Jets, even though he had a 10-6 record in his first year. And a lot of people that were close to the situation blame more of the organization and the structure rather than his talent and his abilities. And by all reports, he was a pretty good leader there. It was just maybe not quite the right fit in terms of organizational value. But he was an elite defensive coordinator before taking that position. He's done a fantastic job turning around what was 2, maybe 3 years ago, a horrendous Tampa defense. And so Todd Bowles is now your head coach at Tampa Bay. Casey Rogers and Larry Foote, who have been assistants on that defensive staff, have now been named their co-defensive coordinators. Rob Gronkowski, meanwhile, hasn't officially made a decision on playing next year, but there is a report out there that says that as of right now, he cannot commit to playing football next year, even with Brady returning. We'll have to see what he actually ends up doing once the season gets closer. Notable free agent signings, linebacker Kazir White is signed with the Eagles. He's an undersized, basically a safety playing down in the box, but has good coverage, helps what at best times has been an average secondary for the Eagles, but has been pretty bad and bleak at times. So a guy in the middle of the defense that can do some things to help out that secondary and coverage seems like a good signing for them. He would have been a good help for the LA Chargers defense if he had stayed there. Linebacker Rashaan Evans, former starter with the Titans, former first-round pick, has signed with the Falcons. Underrated, low-risk signing for a defense that needs a ton of help. Also, wide receiver Devontae Parker has been traded from the Miami Dolphins to the New England Patriots, along with a 5th-round pick. Miami gets a 3rd-round pick in return. I would have thought that they could get more for a guy that's been as productive as Parker has and has at most times been the number 1 for the Dolphins offense. It definitely helps the New England receiving core to have a guy at 6'3", 219, a good size with the success he's had in his career. Having said that, the past couple years haven't been as great. He hasn't had a 1,000-yard season since 2019.